Good day, everyone. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center, as we like to call ourselves. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And one of our signature programs is called the Global China Initiative that looks at China's overseas economic, environmental, and social activity. Before I introduce today's speaker, and welcome you to the Global China Research Colloquium. Just want to tell you about a couple other exciting events that we're going to have here at the GDP Center as we round out the academic semester here in the United States. Really would love to invite everybody tomorrow at 10 a.m. EST for an event that we'll have called Greening Financial Regulatory Policy in Latin America, which is co-sponsored with Inspire Foundation that looks at greening financial systems around the world. Our senior researcher, Daniel Shudlovsky, has led a working group of former central bankers and academics examining microprudential policies for incorporating climate change into central bank policy in Latin America. On Wednesday, May 12th at 4 p.m., our Human Capital Initiative will have a seminar called Promoting Tuberculosis Treatment Completion, Evidence from Large-Scale Field Experiments in Kenya. And related to today's event, we will have a webinar about a new report that we launched, and a report that I co-edited with Haihong Gao from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences Institute for World Economics and Politics. The name of the report is called Building Back a Better Global Financial Safety Net. And our webinar is called Reforming the International Monetary Fund and Beyond, Lessons from COVID-19. We'll have a number of exciting guests for that one. But today, let me welcome Jake Werner. He will be giving a talk today called The Sources of China's Vision for Global Economic Governance. Jake Werner, we're proud to have him as a Global China Fellow. We have a Global China Fellows program that takes promising new leaders for postdoctoral positions. And he's about the 20th of that we've had. Jake is a historian by training. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago, writes a lot about a progressive vision for US-China relations. And today he'll be sharing some of his preliminary research on the sources of China's vision for global economic governance. The way these seminars go, the speaker will speak for about a half hour, and then I will field questions and answers from those of you in the audience and feed them back to Dr. Werner. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen a little box that says Q&A. Please tell us your name and your affiliation, and then add your question, and I'll take clusters of those and feed them to Jake afterwards. So without further ado, welcome Jake Werner. Welcome to all of you, and take it away, Jake.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome to everyone who's joined this morning. I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Okay, so this is a paper that I have written that is sort of early stages of a project to understand the US-China conflict and the motivations on both sides as they've emerged over the last 15 years or so. The aims of the paper, there are a couple of things I'm trying to do here. One is to apprehend how Chinese leaders are thinking about the issue of global economic governance, trying to do so on its own terms. So rather than sort of dismissing it, I think one of the common reactions in the West here is to look at the things that Chinese leaders say and sort of assume it's just window dressing, that really what's going on is like power politics and authoritarianism, and they dress it up with this rhetoric. That's one very common response. I want to really look at the ideology and try to understand what it's saying and why it's meaningful within a Chinese context, which is not to say that we take it literally. I don't think we should take the sort of ideological explications of any ruling elite literally. But I do think that it's meaningful and it's important in terms of both in terms of legitimizing what China thinks it's doing in the world, as well as understanding how Chinese leaders are understanding their own motivations. So I want to try to get away from the idea that there's sort of self-interested reasons that are being covered over by ideology, and think about how those two things can be related. All right, so that's the first issue. The second is to see the ways in which this substantively challenges the liberal international order, the way that it's understood in particular by the US elite. And then I want to historicize what's going on in Chinese ideology in recent history. And I want to try to explain why that ideological account makes sense within China without recourse to essentializing accounts. So I'll come in a few minutes to what I mean by essentializing accounts. And finally, I want to spell out some policy implications of the analysis. All right, so let's jump right into this and see how Chinese leaders are articulating their vision for the global economy and for how it's supposed to be run. I've divided this up into a couple of different facets. The first is to think about the global order in terms of state sovereignty and sovereign equality. So rather than thinking about the system as one kind of undifferentiated universal set of rules that applies equally to everyone, including into internal affairs, there's a very strong assertion of the importance, the fundamental rightness also of state sovereignty, and that this should be the fundamental principle in the global system. This, of course, goes back to the Westphalian concept of the state, but the Chinese leadership fills this out with what is called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which also implies that war and sort of substantive inequalities between states are also barred from this framework. Second issue is, and these two are related, the idea that every country has its own particular situation and its own particular national character. And for that reason, then we need to have state sovereignty as a principle. There's not one set of principles that applies to every country. Every country will need to follow its own path to development. Every country has its own kind of culture and spirit, its own political institutions. And here for the Chinese leadership, of course, the Chinese Communist Party is the essential institution. The Chinese Communist Party finds that it does not fit very comfortably into the liberal democratic norms of the global system. And so it wants to make a principled claim that respecting different systems is fundamentally right, and it's fundamentally to the advantage of the system. It's going to lead to individual countries being more successful than if you imposed a one-size-fits-all system on them. All right, third, there is a universal right to development. So even though there's a strong claim that interference in internal politics is absolutely out of bounds, nonetheless, and even though there's a strong claim that every country has its own individual character, nonetheless, there is this assertion that every country has the right to development. There is a lot of resentment expressed at the global system for not supporting that right to development. And there is an assertion that China, as a great power and as a developing country that has been unusually successful in its path to development, it has an obligation to contribute to this process. So a lot of the foreign policy initiatives that China has unveiled over the last 10 years are situated in this context. They're aimed, the leadership says, to contribute to development in the global South. And finally, there is, these first 3 principles have been in place for some time now. Something that Xi Jinping has added is what he calls jointly building a community of shared human destiny. And this is sort of a wide open phrase, but we can get a sense of what it means more substantively. There's a couple of axes here. One is the idea that the global system needs to be democratized. So just as the global South has a right to develop, it also has a right to articulate its interests and exert its influence within the global system to a degree that is currently not permitted. So there are a number of, in all of the major international institutions, China has asserted the need to reform to incorporate a greater voice and greater representation on the part of the developing countries. And then a second important part of this idea of a community of human destiny is the idea of global public goods. So the most prominent of these has been the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese leadership has said that it's not just about kind of helping development, it's also about creating the public good of connectivity. So we connect finance, we connect trade routes, we connect the communications between different cultures and different nations, and people get to know each other and become closer and work together. There's a rhetoric here about the connectivity as a public good that China is providing in a way that that the existing system has not. And then more recently, the provision of the COVID vaccine has also been asserted as a global public good, and China has said that it will contribute its vaccine to the world to make sure that the global South is inoculated. All right, so how does this vision, in what ways is this vision in tension with the way that the US elite is thinking about the global system? Well, we have state sovereignty on the China side. The idea in the US is that there needs to be binding rules that are not about, that cannot be negotiated. We look at something like the World Trade Organization. It has rules that bind on every country. It's not subject to bilateral negotiations. There is also a very common assertion in the US that the liberal international order has a democratic norm that is that will necessarily impinge on the state sovereignty exclusion that China is claiming. So that's the first tension here. The claim of a particular national character that the Chinese leadership is making, that contrasts with the idea that there are universal standards, universal norms, or universal values. That is a common feature of what the US asserts. Most commonly, these are civil and political rights that go under the heading of democracy and human rights. By the same token, though, China asserts a universal right to development, and the US shrugs that off and says that's not so important. What the US is championing is, above all, the rules of the game, a level playing field, it says, that will be established when we have free markets, where every country respects the rules that are written into the global trade system. That means that things that China has pursued, like state subsidies to support development, or coercing technology transfer to Chinese companies, those things are out of bounds. That is, China is cheating and violating this level playing field. Of course, when you have a level playing field and one set of the actors on that level playing field start out much stronger than others, that means there's a clear advantage to the incumbent. So that's one of the implicit principles that the US is defending. And then finally, there's the sense that there is an obligation that the US and the other rich countries do have an obligation to contribute to those countries that are poor. But this is not articulated as a right. This is more a voluntary choice. It's a form of charity. And finally, on the issue of the community of shared human destiny, what the Chinese leadership essentially is calling for here is an idea of substantive sovereign equality. So this is not just about rules. It's not just about kind of like formal principles. There's a sense that there needs to be, that the equality that's articulated needs to be real, which means that the capacities of different countries need to be elevated if they're below the average, in order to make that exercise of sovereign equality real, and also to make sure that the poorest and the weakest countries can defend themselves against other predatory powers. And in contrast, the principle that the US articulated liberal international order defends is an idea of formal individual freedom that's going to be established by setting up these rules that are positioned as being sort of neutral. So the free market, free movement of commerce, the security of navigation on the seas, these sorts of overarching, these are the kinds of public goods that the United States is interested in securing, in contrast to the Chinese public goods, which have a kind of a substantive element. All right, so what is emerging now, what has emerged over the last few years is, let's go back here. What has emerged over the last few years is that as this tension between these two visions has become more pronounced, there has been a common response where previously US analysts would often say, as globalization proceeds, China is going to adapt and is going to be integrated and is going to become a part of this and accept our version of the rules. Now that has been sorely disappointed. Instead, the Chinese vision seems to be becoming stronger and more insistent. And this is true across a range of issues, not just on the economy, not just on the global economy. But that is leading a lot of analysts on the US side to kind of say, oh, we were wrong. We were under a serious set of illusions here that China was going to change. Now we know that China is not going to change. China is as it is because it's China. And you can see, and this is what I referred to earlier as an essentializing account. So this comes from an essay a couple of years ago on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And Orville Schell is a prominent China watcher. He says, in retrospect, through the ups and downs of decades of diplomatic engagement and growing economic connection, Tiananmen crackdown of 1989 now appears to be the moment when the regime most fully revealed the fundamental principles that now guide Mr. Xi and a rising China. So the idea here is that the Chinese Communist Party, at least, has always been as it is. It's unchanging. There is a kind of fixed essence about it. And we sort of lost sight of that because we had a set of preconceptions that were not well grounded in reality. And now what we're seeing in recent years is that essence is coming back to the surface, and we are now going to regard it in a clear-eyed manner. So this term clear-eyed is all over the place in DC. Like every time someone talks about China, they insist that we have to see it in a clear-eyed fashion. And this gets to the sense that, okay, now we're getting past these illusions that we were under, and we're seeing what it was really there all the time, which is the essence of the party. You see that similarly this is a sort of defining essay that came out a couple of years ago by two of the top Biden China policy people. You see this in the economic conceptualization here, that the party always had this vision of violating the level playing field of the global economy. It was always going to cheat. And before we thought otherwise, now we know what it's like and we have to deal with it on those terms. You even see that in a case like this, where it's not just the Chinese Communist Party that has a kind of unchanging essence, but Chinese culture itself does. And this essay is positioning, this is Quinn Marshak was in the Trump administration. This essay is positioning China as having this intrinsic kind of authoritarian essence. So whether it's about the Chinese Communist Party, the political culture of China, or whether it's about the culture of China, full stop, there's a sense that there's an essence that is now being revealed here. And this is not just on the US side, this is very much on the China side as well. Going back to that idea that every country has a national character, this is something that is embraced and upheld at the top levels of the party. Here we see a couple of examples. The top one is from a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2017 to the United Nations. He says, Chinese civilization through the ages has upheld peace. Peace has infused the veins of the Chinese nationality, is carved into the genes of the Chinese people. So this is a very strong assertion of essence here. And then we have another one from the white paper that came out recently on China's international development cooperation. Similar kind of claim, the cultural roots and spiritual origins of China's international development cooperation. The idea here is that what is driving China's engagement with the world is something intrinsic to Chinese culture. And then there's additional sort of discussion about how the party has innovated on this and sort of taken the best parts of Chinese culture and dropped the bad parts. So in one sense, it's the same kind of account, but of course the signs are reversed. In the US based critique of this, it's negative essence. In the Chinese account, it's positive essence. So what I want to do, what I try to do in this paper is say, look, this is not a good way to understand what's going on in China. China has changed. China is constantly changing. The Chinese Communist Party has also changed and is constantly changing. There is no fixed essence to China or to the party. What we need to do is historicize these things. We need to understand how the current moment in which China and the Chinese Communist Party are asserting their interests and their vision for the future. We need to understand how those things have emerged out of recent history. Give me one second. So the way that I talk about this in the paper is we want to understand how this vision can come to be seen as compelling by looking at the experience of the Chinese Communist leadership over the last 40 years or so. This is the reform and opening period in China. But we want to position that in a broader lens, which is that every capitalist society requires economic growth. Economic growth is very often the condition of judgment. If an initiative is successful, it's because it has helped growth. If it's unsuccessful, it's because it has failed to help growth. And in a very practical sense as well, if economic growth stops in a country, then you have failure and crisis. So we can look at what has happened. This is per capita GDP in purchasing power parity terms over the last 30 years. China has, in contrast to other large developing countries, China has had really outsized success at sustaining growth. And so the kind of specific institutions and the specific ideology, the specific practices of statecraft and economic organization that have produced this, because they have produced such robust growth, that has given the sheen of legitimacy. It has given the sense that that this is particularly in contrast with these other countries. You can see that China on the left-hand side here, China emerged from the poorest countries, clearly moving faster than the other poorest large countries, and it has moved into the ranks of the middle income countries that have grown much more slowly and in a much more unstable fashion. And what that is doing in the Communist Party is telling the Communist Party, okay, we have the right approach to this. Our set of institutions and ideology has achieved success in a way that other countries have not. We have done it without major political upheavals. We have done it while gaining widespread support within the population. This is the sort of the foundations on which there can be an assertion that there's something specific about China that has allowed China to succeed, and that makes sense within the context of China's recent historical experience. So let's kind of go through quickly the account that I lay out here. How is it, and I'm, rather than speaking in terms of the liberal international order here, which is the way that US foreign policy elite tends to talk about this, I'm trying to think a little bit more deeply about the whole social system. So how what's going on internally in a country is embedded within and woven into a larger global system. And for that, I'm using neoliberal globalization as a concept. So, so what does that look like from China's perspective? What has developed over the last 40 years is that on the one hand, China has strongly incorporated into the institutions of the global system. So whether this is the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the G20, China has found a place for itself. It has adapted to the rules. It has not tried to blow up these institutions or discredit them. It does push for reform, as I indicated earlier. but it has embraced these global institutions. And at the same time, there has been a really deep social transformation within China. This is something that is really missed in the essentializing accounts. And I think it's important to make the point that in many ways, the social transformation has really paralleled what has happened in the West. So it's not the case that the existing neoliberal system of free markets and deregulation and privatization and floating exchange rates and all of these things are historically new in the 1980s. So there was a break in the West as there was in China in the 1980s. So whether we're looking at, excuse me, whether we're looking at the rise of market reform, the dismantling of previous large bureaucracies that had really dominated the economy, whether we're looking at the collapse of the organized power of the working class, often accomplished through the power of the state, or whether we're looking at the idea of individual responsibility and self-fashioning, or the ideal of cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism. These are things that have grown in China as they have grown in the West. So Chinese society and state policy emerged in concert with and as an intrinsic part of global currents. The progress of this integration and transformation in China continued up until about 10 years ago. And then you see a reversal, and this is slightly prior to Xi Jinping's arrival on the scene, but it really intensified under Xi Jinping's administration. But again, this reversal was not unique to China. It was part of a worldwide wave of nationalism and authoritarianism that emerged in the major countries around the world. So again, the kind of reactionary turn of the Xi Jinping era makes China not as essentially different from the rest of the world, but very much a part of it. But there were ways in which China was different, not because of the essence of the party or of Chinese culture, but because of the specific position that the party and China occupied within the neoliberal global system. And I'm calling that the authoritarian technocratic liberalism that the Chinese state has implemented over the last, particularly over the last 20 years, the 1980s. Sorry, the last 30 years. The 1980s was a little bit different. Rather than just dismantling the state, as happened in, for example, in the shock therapy countries of the Soviet bloc, rather than dismantling the state, what happened, particularly beginning in the 90s, was that the state was invested with new powers, not to end liberalization, but specifically in order to administer neoliberal reform. So this is kind of jarring to the Western perspective, where there's this sharp binary between the state and the market. In the Chinese context, the state and the market are working together, and that's understood quite explicitly in the work of someone like Wang Huning, who is one of the most important top advisors. He was an academic at Fudan University, and has been a top advisor for Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, which is quite unusual. So the idea here is that neoliberal transformation will be administered by the state. The state is not fundamentally aimed at just destroying discontent, although it does do that. The reason that discontent has to be suppressed is so that reform can proceed further. And then the idea is that eventually reform will change things in a way that will deal with that discontent. Now, it's worth noting that it didn't work out quite that way, that the neoliberal transformation of Chinese society caused discontent to continue and to become even more intense. And that in turn cultivated this idea that, okay, the state needs to stay strong to deal with this. So how is that then connected to the global system? Because harking back to one of these key features, the dismantling of the power of the working class was essential to the Chinese development strategy, because it was trying to attract foreign capital in order to exploit cheap Chinese labor. Of course, the abuses and exploitation that are involved in that model of development also led to constant discontent, which meant that the Chinese state had to stay strong to make sure that the whole process kept going. So this is not This is not something essential about the party or about China. This is something that the party emerged, or the party, the nature of the party has changed over the last 40 years, and it has done so in connection to the global system. Another key aspect of this is that China came into the system in a position of subordination, and it has moved up quite a bit within the hierarchy of nations and in the global economy. That has given a sense of validation to the strategy the party has pursued. It has also given rise to a really strong sense of resentment against the countries at the top of the system, particularly because that mobility was met with fear and repulsion and criticism. The Chinese Communist Party leadership is very sensitive to international criticism. And part of that comes from a kind of an inferiority complex that emerges from starting out at the bottom of the system, and starting out at the bottom of the system economically, but also culturally and politically. Precisely that particularity that allowed China to succeed within the global system comes into tension with the universality of the values that are proclaimed by the countries at the top of the system. And that gives rise to a resentment on the part of the leadership that the people at the top are trying to prevent us from succeeding because this is the only way we can succeed. They feel challenged by us. And this is a very one-sided account, of course, of the motivations on the part of the US and the West. But it makes sense given the experience of China in the globalization era. And I go into a couple of different cases here where there's been a widespread sense that the US has been unfair and has wronged China in global economic governance. There's the accession negotiations to the WTO. There's the attempt on the part of the Obama administration to destroy the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank a couple of years ago before it was founded. And then there's Trump's trade war. I give some details on that. And then finally, we have, even though there is a strong experience of subordination on the part of the Chinese leadership, there has also been the sense that by engaging with the world, that is what has allowed China to grow and develop. And the going out, before there was the Belt and Road, there was affirmation of and encouragement of Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese state-owned enterprises to go out and join the global economy, look for opportunities in other countries. And that was positioned as a way to help countries in the global south that have not had access to capital to develop. And there are a lot of important problems with the Belt and Road Initiative that need to be recognized, but it is not wrong to say that many of these initiatives have provided capital that poor countries previously did not have access to, and has supported development, a certain kind of development, in a number of countries. And as a part of that process of going out and joining the global economy, Chinese leaders have also familiarized themselves with obstacles to further growth. And this is where the idea of a community of shared human destiny is coming from, the idea that there are a set of global public goods that are not being provisioned the way the global system works now. And China is interested, both rhetorically and in practice, in applying itself to solve those problems. All right, so if we sort of go back to this initial characterization of the Chinese vision, hopefully in this brief description of what I'm talking about in the paper, we can see it's the particular form of growth that China has pursued and its particular position it has occupied within the global economy that has rendered these different values and claims plausible to the leadership. So it's not just an exercise in window dressing over naked power interests or something. This is the way that Chinese leadership is understanding what has happened over the last 30 to 40 years. And we can see, if we look sort of empathetically at the experience of China over the last 30 to 40 years, why that would make sense. But we're in a context now where the where the global economy has run into kind of a wall. And so the final question that I try to tackle in this paper is the Chinese vision for global economic governance up to the task of breaking through this wall that we've hit? And you can see here, this is one way of seeing the ways in which the globalization era has sort of lost its dynamism, has created increasing frictions, has increasingly thrown the US and China against each other in a zero-sum fashion because rates of growth, rates of expansion of trade, expansion of foreign investment, these things have all dramatically declined after 2008. Here's another way of measuring that. You can see that the global economy relied for consumer demand, purchasing power on increasing levels of debt. After 2008, that plateaued in the developed countries and China suddenly shot up to much higher levels. That has sustained a basically dysfunctional growth process where consumer demand and purchasing power are fueled by debt. This is coming out of the COVID economic crisis. We'll see if this can survive, but in any case, one way in which this has to be confronted is through development. We need to spread the ability to buy the products that are being produced in the global economy much more widely. And so in that sense, the Chinese vision is very much in line with the needs that the global economy has right now. Let's go through these quickly so we can wrap up. Conclusion and policy implications. China is not alien to the so-called liberal international order, but is a product of it, comes out of it. It represents the China challenge represents a fault line within that system. It's not one between different, essentially Western and essentially Chinese systems. Anti-China, this is another facet of my research that I haven't gone into detail in this talk on, but is an important corollary here. Anti-China politics in the US only addresses a symptom of this deeper problem. And if it continues, it will lead to spiraling zero-sum conflict because it hasn't addressed the underlying problem, which is growth in the global economy. An effective response requires restructuring the global system to revive growth and legitimacy. China's particular vision of economic governance does offer some essential contributions to that project, in particular, the idea of global public goods and the right to development. But it is partial. So China comes from a particular position within the system. And so it's no surprise that it would have a partial vision of how to move that system forward. But we need to recognize what it's missing. In particular, what's missing from the Chinese vision are labor rights, sustainability goals, and cultural pluralism. These are all essential to overcoming that fundamental stagnation within the global economy that we're facing right now. Labor rights, to make sure that purchasing power is broadly spread rather than development leading just to a further concentration of wealth in the elite. Sustainability, to deal with the climate crisis, which if it's not dealt with will of course undermine the conditions for further growth. And cultural pluralism, in order to deepen globalization in a way that sort of moves to the next level, there needs to be a welcoming of cultural difference that has really been repudiated in China in recent years. So this is sort of, I'll end here just with the point that the US and China both are bringing things to this issue. If they were to work together to complement each other's vision, that could move us beyond this impasse. If they continue to dig into conflict, then I think we're facing a very difficult future. All right, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Jake, for that very clear-eyed look at China and the United States and the international economic order. Folks, we've got about 20 minutes to have some conversation with Dr. Werner. If you go into the Q&A box and tell us your name and affiliation, I'll get to as many as I can. Why don't I start with the first cluster? First, we have Isabella Weber from the economics department in UMass Amherst, who has a forthcoming book coming out about how China avoided shock therapy in its transition. Her question is, great presentation on the point of sovereignty versus binding rules. I wonder whether this is really a binary or whether the tension does not lie in the nature and extent of the rule in particular as they pertain to domestic issues? That's one question. Fernando Herrero from the University of London asks if you could just provide a few good China sources, authors, institutions, thinkers inside the Chinese Communist Party, think tanks, etc., that you drew on to get to this Chinese vision, so that others can look at that. Sam Giel pushes back a little bit and says he can't quite wrap his head around this concept that you just introduced called authoritarian liberalism. He says it sort of rings true, but it's also comfortably oxymoronic. And could you go deeper into that? And let me just do one more, and then I'll do another round if you answer these ones short and sharp. We have Xin Fan from SUNY Fredonia. Xin Fan's question is, speaking about China's global visions, I assume this is primarily about the CCP and its leaders' visions. I've noticed there seems to be an attempt to shift the focus of the discussion away from ideology, especially Marxism, either inside the party or outside China. Is it still relevant for us to understand the party's ideological position in regards to Marxism in any meaningful way? Or has it been translated into some detailed policy implications? That's quite a crop of four of them. We'll let you get to those, and then I'll move to there's another group here as well. Thanks, Jake.
Yes, great set of questions. To Bella's question, I think that's right. That's certainly right that that there could be a set of binding rules that that gave more space to sovereignty. I think that's what the party would look for. My own view on this is something of a mix here, that there does need to be more policy space to pursue development. The kind of neoliberal regime on capital controls and currencies and structural adjustments, which has suffered a series of blows over the last 15 years, but is still intact. That I don't think that does give enough space for countries to be able to pursue development. At the same time, I do think there needs to be transnational coordination on a set of rules around climate and labor if we're to return to healthy growth in the global economy. So I think probably maybe the relevant question here is, what is actually going to work in practice? Yes, in principle, you can have any sort of combination of rules with sovereignty or with abstract universal standards of liberal democracy. You could have a wide spectrum here, but probably the question, I think that the important question is what we need now, given the situation that the global economy is in now. Hopefully that addresses that question. The sources that I'm using here are largely speeches and articles coming from top party officials: Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, Yang Jiechi, and then other articles that were published in authoritative outlets like People's Daily, the Qiushi, which is a party theory journal, and I'm happy to share a list of sources. So anyone who's interested in that, just feel free to get into contact with me after this. Question about authoritarian liberalism is extremely interesting. I think it helps to. I don't think it's actually a paradox, and the Chinese theorists who developed the thinking behind this don't think it's a paradox either, because the idea is that we need a strong state in order to get us to the point where we can enjoy democracy and liberalization. This is in the late 80s, when these ideas were first being developed. That was the explicit motivation, that a strong state is needed so that we can create the conditions under which we can have a liberal democratic order. Now, as I said, what ends up happening is that the neoliberal reform process introduces forms of instability that constantly defer that goal. And so we're no closer, in fact, we're further away today than we were 10 years ago from any kind of real liberal democracy in China. A part of that is a repudiation, and I think what Xi Jinping is doing is beginning to move in a different direction. There's a different set of substantive goals now, and that has to do with the general crisis of neoliberal values and institutions that has unfolded over the last 10 years. But that's a whole different topic that we would need another hour to even start talking about. But I think on the question of whether authoritarian liberalism makes sense, the historical analog here is 19th century liberalism, which overwhelmingly looked much more like the Communist Party's version than it does like the US ideal of this. The idea was that liberalism requires a state strong in certain ways, in particular a state that can repress labor unrest and make sure that any sorts of challenges that are envisioned as being external to the system will be contained or destroyed. So whether that is union activity, strikes, whether that is uprisings by the colonial populations, whether that is crime by the underclass, these things all require a strong state. And democracy, electoral democracy, was a distinctly secondary characteristic when it even existed in 19th century liberalism. And I think we can also think about the ways in which the kind of the reality of US liberal democracy. There is, of course, elections in the US, but there is also a state that has become much stronger now over the last 40 years than it was previously in terms of dealing with those parts, with those people who are thought to challenge the basic system of growth. And we see that in the growth and strengthening of the criminalization system and mass incarceration. And we also see that in the growth of overseas policing operations to deal with so-called rogue states. So the use of the state to repress energies and people who are threatening to the stability of economic growth, that is common across all forms of capitalism. It is well known in liberal variants as well as illiberal variants. There are tensions within the ideology, but those tensions are internal to the system. It's not a competition between different systems. The final question was about Marxism. I think it is important actually to understand what the party means when it says Marxism. Now, what the party means when it says Marxism has essentially nothing to do with Marxist thinking. It's quite at odds with Marxist thinking in many different ways. But it does come out of a particular tradition of Marxism that has changed. There is no essence of Marxism either. Marxism as a body of thought changes with history. So it has changed, but it does come out of a body of thinking in the party and in Marxism-Leninism as a theory of political, or as a tradition of political theory. And it is worth, I think, understanding what is going on there. I really strongly reject the idea that we can dispense with ideology and just kind of get to economic interests or power interests or self-interest or whatever. I think ideology and interests and values, they are co-constitutive. There is a distinct relation among them. There are very few people in the world who imagine their interests to be different in some, or sort of extraneous to their values. And ultimately the way that I deal with this question of values versus interests is to embed it within a conceptualization of how the social system works. So in the conceptualization of capitalism that I'm working with here, a particular form of growth is always in tension with the needs of social reproduction to establish the foundations on which that growth unfolds. And what's going on both in terms of interests and values, are attempts to manage that tension. So people's values arise out of the system of growth and social reproduction. Their interests arise out of that as much as their values. In fact, I find that particular binary to be not terribly useful. And so I think we should try to understand Marxism as a part of this. So I kind of highlighted the idea of national essence that the party is employing. I think that's an important development that was not there 50 years ago within the party. But we also need to pay attention to what they mean by Marxism. And I think essentially what Marxism is here is something like state-led developmentalism, in which the party plays a strong role in making sure that all of the sort of centrifugal forces that are pulling society, of a market-based society, in different directions, that they all sort of cohere together to sustain growth and stability and political legitimacy. And the ways in which those goals started to diverge over the first decade of the 21st century, a lot of Xi Jinping's agenda is attempting to deal with the problems that came out of that. So once again, the authoritarianism that has emerged very strongly and repudiated a previous liberalization process in the party and Chinese society under Xi Jinping, that's something that's responding to specific historical conditions that are embedded within a larger global system, as well as in the way that Chinese society has developed over the last 30 years, and we need to understand them in those terms. And what Xi Jinping is doing with Marxism is in part trying to come up with a theory to deal with those tensions, and in part also trying to establish some kind of stable reference point. So Chinese culture is one of those. There's this like intrinsic, foundational, stable Chinese essence. And then Marxism within the party is another one of those. There's a stable body of thought that can ground what the party is and what it does. I reject that idea because I don't believe in essentializing accounts, but that is a key goal of what the party is doing with all of this, the Marxism revival, and all of Xi Jinping's speeches about this, and all the study groups that they organize.
Thanks, Jake. We've got 5 more minutes and 500 questions that have come in. I'll try to give sort of soundbite versions of most of them if I can, and if you could wrap in closing remarks quickly while trying to hit as many of these as you can. Mark Mealy from the United States ASEAN Business Council says he's often sensed that China's elites have overly tied or influenced by US financial elites and Wall Street, and have undervalued or underappreciated the differences within the US elite and corporate community. How do you see that? Sam Giel, since you asked a question before, I'm going to skip that one. Juliet Liu, season ticket holder to the GCI from Cornell University, says, Jake, on the BRI and China's drawing on opportunity through going out, I've been drawn to an argument that a lot of Chinese overseas engagements are still driven by an effort by the CCP to maintain domestic control, that domestic politics takes primacy over all else. Do you think global leadership, diplomacy, et cetera, is a real goal of Chinese leadership on its own right, or that it's primarily a means to the end of domestic control? For example, seeking political stability and economic ties as a means for ensuring Chinese domestic growth and political stability. That one would take an hour to answer. I'm going to throw a bunch. I'm just going to throw these out here just so that everyone in the audience can chew on them. But Jake, you're only going to have a couple minutes to respond. Meir Alkin, who's a joint postdoctoral fellow here at the GDP Center and at Harvard University, says, you suggested that re-strengthening of the Chinese state occurred as a result of the dislocations arising from globalization in general, the specific experience of reform and opening in particular. Taking the counterfactual at face value, does this mean that you think Absent such dislocations, the global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, et cetera, that the Chinese state would have diminished in strength, or at least become less involved in guiding and steering the market. Zhang Yuan Lu from CIRUP at Tufts University agrees with you and says, let's see, could you elaborate on the nature of how the party has changed? How is your concept of authoritarian technocratic liberalism different from other concepts such as state capitalism? Gosh, there's just there's a lot of them here. Hopefully we can capture these and you can write bilaterally to so many of these other questions that have cropped up now, but you've only got 3 minutes. You can't answer the ones that I read to you in 3 minutes. We've clearly sparked a great conversation here. Jake's working paper will be posted on our webpage shortly, and we can have a global discussion in that manner. Jake, why don't you make some closing remarks and attempt to answer some of these? And sorry, my friend Arnab Ghosh and Martin Thorley, our employee Yan Wang, Barbara Neve. Sorry, we're not going to be able to get to all your questions. Take it away, Jake.
Yeah, great. These are all great questions. I think on the issue of that Juliet raised about domestic politics being primary, I think that's right. But at the same time, I want to, I guess one of the goals of the paper is to think about the way that these things are inseparable from each other. The domestic versus international binary. These two things are embedded within each other. And so while I do think that that domestic politics are primary, that ultimately the main impetus of Chinese foreign policy at the central level is to create a good global environment for Chinese development and growth. I think that's certainly right, and I think you could also say that a lot of the other initiatives that are driven by specific corporations or by specific provincial governments, they are sort of pursuing an agenda that is not primarily motivated by a vision for the global economy. Nonetheless, I think that these things are connected to each other, and that the possibilities in the global system shape the ideas domestically about what strategies will work, and also kind of condition the possibilities in the global economy shape thinking domestically, and what's going on domestically affects the way that the party talks about its vision for the global economy. So there's a co-constitutive relationship here. And ultimately, the argument in the paper is that the vision for the global economy comes out of the experience of growth within the neoliberal global economy, but also the sort of domestic experience of that can be projected onto a global stage. That's not a totally adequate answer, but I think we'll stop it there. Myers' question about in the absence of the neoliberal global economy, would the state have liberalized in a deeper and more genuine way? I guess, I mean, as a historian, I don't really like counterfactuals. I think that the developments in domestic society always necessarily are conditioned by the larger global system. And that means that we can't imagine a condition under which sort of the state left to its own would go in a particular direction. I think the way that I would think about this is rather that China's embeddedness within the global system created both, in an important way, created both the impetus for persistent authoritarianism and the demand for liberalization. That those two things represent a contradiction within the neoliberal global system and Chinese society rather than two separate principles. So again, I don't believe in sort of cultural essence or the essence of particular ideas. Those ideas exist as two sides of the same coin rather than as separate principles that could pull apart from each other. So the fact that liberalization in important dimensions proceeded in this period, even as the authoritarianism of the state persisted, that is two sides of the same coin. That's responding to contradictory demands within the global system and within Chinese society as it emerges, given the structure of opportunity within the global system, rather than something that we could sort of take away one variable and be like, okay, the other variable will develop in this particular direction. The two variables are fundamentally linked. And so that maybe that's a good place to end it, because I think that ultimately what I'm trying to do with this paper is offer a reconceptualization of the way that we think about China and the Communist Party and its relation to the global system, that I think is both more theoretically robust and will offer us political opportunities that we don't have as long as we continue to think in the kind of strong binaries that are currently being used.
Thank you very much, Jake, and thanks everyone for coming and all these great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. As I said in my opening remarks, invite everyone to go to the GDP Center webpage, sign up so you can learn more about these events. Follow us on Twitter. You can see our Twitter handle here. We have an exciting event tomorrow about climate change and central banking in Latin America. And to pick up on this theme, I edited a report with one of the leading people thinking about Chinese global economic governance, Haihong Gao, on the need to and pathways to reform global economic governance and the IMF in particular in a way that that makes some of these visions come together. That one's on May 19th. So take a look at our webpage and sign up for that too. Thanks a lot, Jake. Big round of applause for you. Thanks everyone for coming. Happy spring if it's spring from where you're at. If not, it's on the way. Be
Thanks,
safe,
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.